Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Closing the Skills Gap, the Need for Partnerships Between Employers and Higher Education. My name is Alex Seabrook, Events Marketing Specialist at Learning House, and I am happy to be joined today by Jeremy Walsh, Senior Vice President of Enterprise Learning Solutions at Learning House. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions and comments. Please type your questions and comments into the chat pane and be sure to send your message to all staff and not only the organizer or presenter to ensure they get answered. A moderator will respond to questions in the chat pane throughout the presentation. We will also take 15 minutes following today's 45-minute presentation for our presenter to answer your questions. A copy of today's PowerPoint slides, as well as a recording of today's presentation, will be sent to all attendees. And now, I will introduce our presenter. Jeremy Walsh is Senior Vice President of Enterprise Learning Solutions at Learning House. He focuses on strengthening the value proposition for Learning House clients by developing key partnerships that accelerate growth. Prior to joining Learning House, Jeremy oversaw business development initiatives for organizations such as Apollo Group, Kaplan, and Mount Washington College. With that, I turn the presentation over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us with us today. I'm excited to share with you some of the findings of our Closing the Skills Gap research. Part of the reason we did this research is on an almost weekly basis, we speak with organizations ranging from Fortune 500 companies to regional healthcare systems and even local hospitals and police departments. And we hear all about challenges they have around finding the right people. This is a daily struggle for many of us in the workforce. We hear about struggles with high turnover. We hear about college grads that come into the workforce that are far from what many would deem as work ready, and other similar challenges. And being that Learning House has made it our mission to improve people's lives through education, we felt that these are challenges we should know more about and see how we might be a part of the solution. So through our Learning House Enterprise Learning Solutions division, which is the division I lead, we get to work closely with both educators and enterprise organizations in an effort to help produce better workforce outcomes. And so we set out to learn more about how the growing skills gap in America is impacting the economy and impacting our nation and impacting workers. And today I get to share what we learned. So I hope you're interested and excited to learn a little bit more, because we're going to dive into this right now. But first, let me tell you, moving on to the next slide, let me tell you a little bit about how we did the research. We got a chance to partner with my friend, Dan Schwabel, who's a New York Times bestselling author. He's also partner and research director at an organization called Future Workplace. And for those of you who may not know Future Workplace, they're an executive development firm really dedicated to reimagining the workforce. They get the opportunity to work with chief human resource officers and chief learning officers at many of today's top companies, and really it's somewhat of a think tank around how different trends are impacting the workforce and how to reimagine and rethink what that looks like. So we were excited to partner with them to do this this research, and together we conducted a survey with over right at 600 HR leaders across the U.S. That was across 12 different industries and sectors, including manufacturing, retail, hospitality, healthcare, education, some public sector and public service, financial services, logistics, even nonprofit, and a few others. So it was a pretty broad set of constituents that and respondents that we worked with. 43% of them were C-level, chief learning officer or chief HR officer, in some cases chief talent officer or something in that area, or VP level leaders. So 43% were in kind of what we would call the executive group, and then the rest were what we would consider middle management, so directors or managers of people. And so had a pretty diverse set of viewpoints across kind of the hierarchy of the organization there. 35% of our respondents were millennials, and 75% had at least a bachelor's degree. 96%, almost all of them, 96% had some college. And across our survey, we really focused on 5 major themes, which we're going to look at today as we move on to the next slide. So the first theme that we want to look at today is really around college and work readiness. And we've heard a lot about this. If you kind of follow the skills gap trend and you follow all the discussions around this theme, you often hear about college and work readiness. And the main premise is, how is college doing at preparing students to be work ready? And so with that, before I get into what we found in the research, I actually want to ask you all that question. And so Alex is going to help me out. We're going to do a poll question. And the question is, how do you feel your institution is doing at preparing students to be work ready? So most of you attending today are from universities or academic institutions, you're educators. We do have a few from other organizations, enterprise organizations on with us as well. But I want to ask you, how do you feel your institution is doing at preparing students to be work ready? And so we've got a decent number of respondents here. It looks like most of you feel like you guys are doing okay. A few of you think you're doing great, but most are saying, yeah, we're doing okay. So that's great. No one felt that you're not doing that good. So that's also a positive sign for those of you on the line today. Don't worry, this poll is completely anonymous. So even if you felt like you're not doing that good, it's anonymous. We're not going to tell anyone. So let's see what our HR leaders actually thought about this. So moving on to the next slide. College, how is it doing preparing students to be work ready? This study found that almost half of employers felt that really colleges, universities, educators really aren't doing a great job at preparing students for the working world. And so 47% felt that, no, answer the question no. 53% said, yeah, college is doing okay at preparing students to be work ready. Moving on to the next slide, we drilled down just a little deeper and took a closer look at specifically large companies, Fortune 500 companies. So looking specifically at the large Fortune 500 companies that responded in our survey, we found that 57% of them felt that college isn't preparing students to be work ready. So it was interesting to see, the larger the organization, the more they felt that college isn't preparing, students for the workforce. So I thought that was an interesting finding. So let's do one more poll here real quick. Moving on to the next slide. Who do you believe is most responsible for employees being work ready? We asked our respondents the same thing, and we gave them 3 options: employers, colleges, or students. So employers, colleges, and students. So who do you feel, or who do you believe is most responsible for employees being work ready? Let's give a couple more seconds here for people to respond, and we'll see how you feel. All right. So this is actually very similar to the findings in our survey. Majority of people believe that students are the first to be responsible. And then secondly would be colleges. And then lastly would be employers. And so moving on to the next slide, I want to show you the actual results that we got. So over a third of our HR leader respondents say that colleges are most responsible for getting an employee to be work ready. Overall, everyone did put the onus primarily on students. I think we all believe in the concept of agency, that an individual has their own responsibility to prepare themselves. But from there, the responsibility kind of moved to colleges and then to employers. What was interesting when we dug deeper into the data here, we looked specifically at what our C-level, VP level, or kind of the executive leadership that responded here. And they are much more likely to take the responsibility and say that employers are more responsible than colleges to prepare students to be work ready. And this is something that you wouldn't have seen even 4 years ago. This is a trend that has continued to go up over the last several years, where more and more companies are starting to take more ownership around how they prepare their employees, kind of their coming in employees, to be work ready, and they're doing a lot of different things around that. Moving on to the next slide. So we asked them the question specifically around, in the last 3 years, has your organization collaborated with colleges to make the curriculum more responsive to workplace needs? We wanted to get a sense to how much HR leaders are engaging with colleges and universities and educators, really to make a difference around this skills gap. It seems like there is a skills gap. It seems like students that are coming out of colleges aren't prepared to be, great employees necessarily. So are they working with educators to make a difference? And over 40% of companies haven't collaborated with colleges to make the curriculum more responsive to workplace needs. They haven't engaged with colleges or universities in order to work on outcomes within, programmatic level outcomes. We also found that almost a third of HR leaders felt that colleges in general don't have a good pipeline of talent with the right skills to fill their current and future roles. So this speaks really directly to the disconnect in programs offered at many institutions, or maybe even down to the outcomes level, that the outcomes being taught in those programs no longer align with where the jobs in those industries are. And where we've seen things in many states like Florida, that at the state level they're trying to tackle this problem. This is where kind of government gets involved, and they're trying to tackle some of these problems by restricting funding for state schools based on programs, what they would call programs of strategic emphasis. And it looks different in every state, but for instance, in Florida, they have programs of strategic emphasis, and so they have a kind of a reward factor or better funding availability for institutions that graduate students in those programs of strategic emphasis. But I think in general, it's something that all educators can take a look at and learn from, and say, wow, if only 40% or if 40% of companies haven't yet collaborated, and yet there's this big challenge, this might be an opportunity. So moving on, couple key takeaways from this theme, what we call the work ready theme. One, majority of corporate leaders feel that students aren't work ready. And this continues to be an ongoing trend. That's kind of been a trend for since 2012, when one of the, Gallup did a similar research way back then that found something similar. I think they asked the question slightly different. They had a different audience. They were asking CEOs how they felt about students, how well they would say that colleges are doing to prepare students. And they basically gave them an F and said, 10% of CEOs felt like colleges were doing really good, and 90% felt like they weren't doing that great. They also asked academic leaders and provosts, chief academic officers, similar question, and obviously the chief academic officers and provosts said that 90% of them felt like they were doing a great job at preparing students to be work ready. and only 10% said that they weren't doing so good. So obviously it's been a big disconnect, and we haven't closed that gap as much as we would like. So additionally, companies are taking on more ownership, and some might view that as good, some might view that as bad. I don't think it's either. I think it's, if anything, it is a sign that in many cases, because they're going to take on more ownership, they're more oriented around a solution now. Whereas before, it would be more of a pointing fingers and saying, well, this institution or that education group or whoever is not doing a great job. And now, it's starting to impact their ability to be successful, their company's ability to be successful. And so more and more companies are taking on ownership, which I think provides a great opportunity as well. And then lastly, executive leaders are open and willing for collaboration with colleges and universities. And so I think this is a great time for those of us who are in education to be pursuing those kinds of conversations and to be creating that dialogue, which is partly what this study is about, is to try to encourage more of that dialogue and hopefully create community where that dialogue leads to actionable solutions for even on regional and local levels for companies and organizations, as well as higher education institutions, to collaborate to figure out how we can do a better job at closing the skills gap that exists. All right, so moving on to our second theme. This theme is really around the growing skills gap. So, this is our biggest theme, and we'll spend most of our time today here. But we really dive a little bit deeper into, how big is the skills gap? What is some of the impact of the skills gap? And so hopefully some interesting data that you guys will get here. So overall, American job openings rose to 6.3 million in January. I think I saw the July numbers at 6.8 million. And so it's, comparatively last January in 2017, 5.4 million job openings. And then you compare that against the backdrop of our unemployment rate, which is really the lowest it's been in a long time, but there's still about 6.8 million people out there looking for jobs. And so really there should be, assuming everyone had the right skills, there's enough jobs for everyone to have a job if they had the right skills. And so this theme starts to look at some of those types of topics. And so let's just get right into it. So this is our last and final polling question, but I do want to ask you guys, what would you estimate as the average length of time a skill is usable? We asked our HR leaders the same question. What would you estimate as the average length of time that a skill is usable? So take a moment here, cast your ballot, and we'll see what our polling audience thinks today. What would you estimate as the average length of time a skill is usable? All right, so interesting. There's quite a few that feel that 23% greater than 6 years, which means the rest of us believe that it's less than 6 years. And so very similar to the data that we got back from our HR leaders. So let's just move on to the next slide and see what they believe. So when we asked HR leaders the same question, 52% estimate that the usefulness of a skill is 6 years or less. So 52% felt that it was 6 years or less. Contrast that to the fact that most college students take around 6 years to complete their degree. And hypothetically, I know it doesn't play out exactly this way in the real world, but hypothetically, this means that it's possible that most of what Most of the hard skills that students learn in their freshman year, their first year of college, might be completely irrelevant by the time that they graduate. Now, we know that much of what they're learning in that first year is not necessarily technical hard skills, but I think it's an interesting thought that the usefulness of a skill is about 6 years or less, according to many people's opinion. However, with the way that it's taking many students to complete their college degree, and you contrast those two, it creates some interesting dynamics there. According to John Seely Brown and Professor Peter Denning in 2012, they stated that the half-life of a learned skill is about 5 years, and this means that much of what you learned 10 years ago is obsolete, and half of what you learned 5 years ago is mostly irrelevant. And so if you think about that, you know, around emerging technologies and automation and digital platforms and data and how those things are reshaping the workplace right now at such a rapid pace, um, you can see some of the dynamics that this kind of short lifespan of a skill can create. And according to research by the Institute for the Future, approximately 85% of the jobs that will exist in 2030 haven't even been created yet. So that poses a real challenge for educators in preparing students for jobs that don't exist, and possibly even skills that we haven't thought of yet. And to help put that in perspective of how fast things are happening, 10 years ago, last month, Apple launched the App Store, and many of us on the phone today, I would gather, can't imagine a time that we didn't have an app. I mean, we're using multiple apps a day, but just over 10 years ago, an app didn't exist, which meant the job of an app developer did for a mobile app developer didn't exist 10 years ago. And when you think about that, you can also think about other jobs that didn't exist not that long ago. Things like Amazon drone drivers or driverless car engineers and operators, or even a social media manager or sustainability managers or data scientists, cloud computing specialists, or telemedicine physicians. I don't know if any of you have used Teladoc, but telemedicine physicians are fairly new. And so this rate of change and the short kind of this collision between the shortening of the lifespan of a skill and the pace at which technology is happening, it's creating a lot of interesting dynamics in helping to expand, not reduce, the skills gap. So moving on to the next slide, we asked organizations, is there a skills gap? Just point blank, is there a skills gap in your organization? And 52% believe that there is a skills gap in their organization. What was interesting about this is, moving on to the next slide, when we asked them if they were clear on what the skills gap is, 35% of them who said there is a skills gap said that they aren't really that clear on what it is. So that poses a real challenge. I mean, realizing that you have a problem, but you don't know what the problem is. And that's kind of the scenario that's happening in many corporations and organizations today. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what the challenge is. Now, obviously, 35% means that there's a decent number, 65% that are pretty clear on the skills gap, and that's great. But it is a little shocking that many, 35%, realize that there is a problem, but they don't know what it is exactly. All right, let's move on to the next slide. We also asked them about how hard it is to fill their jobs and how many jobs went unfilled last year in 2017. And 70% of our respondents had up to 500 jobs go unfilled last year. 10% of our respondents collectively had over 30,000 jobs go unfilled last year. And that's really mind-boggling to think about, because when you think about that kind of impact to an individual company, that they could have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 or more jobs go unfilled in a single year, that's pretty significant. 47% of employers blame the fact that they're having such a hard time filling these jobs. They blame that on not enough qualified candidates in the workforce. And majority of them said that 2018 is not getting any easier. So I think we're still, we haven't figured out solutions. We're still trying to grapple with the problem of how big and how vast and all the reasons at which this skills gap exists. On the next slide, we look at the causes of the skills gap, and we asked our employers to share, what they believe their three biggest causes of the skills gap are at their company. And here's kind of what they shared. When hiring for certain jobs, there just aren't enough candidates out there, which that's kind of pretty obvious. That's the biggest, 47%. Next is pace of change in technology. 34% believe that the pace of change in technology is the biggest reason that there's a skills gap. There's a real lack of digital fluency. There's a real lack of digital integration into their job. There's skills that they didn't know that they needed, and maybe there isn't as much training, certainly not training at the collegiate level there to help with some of those things. And then the last two causes listed here are kind of tied for third place at 32%. But one is skills of current workforce or current employees that are employed at the company do not match the needs of the company. So even though they might have a lot of great talented people at the company, 32% of our respondents said that those people just don't have the right skills, and it's causing the skills gap. And this really, to me, speaks pretty significantly to the fact that the skills gap is not just about people graduating from college and moving into the workforce. It's actually much bigger than that. It's about people in the workforce who have skills, they have old skills maybe or outdated skills, and they need reskilling or upskilling. And we've actually experienced this firsthand working with a financial services company out of the New England area. And they had several individuals who were in network engineering, and that's a skill that now that they're moving to cloud computing and cloud-based servers, network engineering was not as in demand of a job that they had. So rather than doing layoffs, they took the opportunity to upskill these people into software development and moved about 100 or more individuals into new software development jobs through a upskilling program. And so, I think we're going to see more and more companies leaning in that direction. But the point being is the skills gap is not just about people coming out of college and the fact that certain programs aren't up to speed yet, or their learning outcomes are misaligned or that type of thing. It's much bigger than that. And the last one here, lack of employee development initiatives and options, also speaks to that same thing. We're not talking about students at college, we're talking about employees and initiatives and options available for those employees to upskill and to gain the relevant skills to stay to help themselves and to help their company stay competitive in the marketplace. So thought this was some pretty interesting data here. If you move on to the next slide, we look at really, we asked the question, what are the three largest business impacts of having a skills gap? So what are the three largest business impacts of having a skills gap? And we got some good information. Again, obviously, a skills gap causes challenges in recruitment. That was kind of the biggest. Missed opportunities, less efficient. But this next one was really the one that stood out the most to me. Almost a third of HR leaders, a third of employers said that the skills gap is making their company less profitable. And that's a shocking data point, especially when we get on to the fifth theme that we'll get to here soon. But a third of employers believe that this skills gap is causing them to be less profitable. And it's creating a situation where it's harder to compete. I think that's pretty significant. And it seems like that would start to drive investment in closing the skills gap. And so hopefully we'll see that. We'll talk about that in a second. Moving on to the last slide here of this theme. So the key takeaways around the growth of the skills gap theme were the skills gap isn't going away, it's growing. It's having a real impact on our nation's economy. The lack of qualified candidates and the speed of change in technology remains a major challenge. And both companies and employees, or companies and students, if you want to say it that way, really need help with this challenge. And I think all three of these takeaways really could speak directly to educators around and hopefully spur ideas for educators around things that we might do to try to help remediate some of this. So, all right, moving on to theme number 3, in-demand skills. We wanted to get a sense around what skills they felt, our employers felt, were causing the skills gap. And not surprisingly, if we move on into the data here, on the next slide, you'll see that we start to uncover that a lot of the theme really rolls around technology. And so when we ask them which roles are the hardest to fill, employers say that 43% of them say that technology and IT roles are the hardest to fill, followed by management, operations, and engineering. And then again, when you move to the next slide, you'll see, we asked which skills are the most in demand at your company. And specifically the hard skills that are most in demand right now are strategic thinking and analytical skills. 59% say that, which is interesting to me because we've been talking about critical thinking, in higher education. We've been talking about critical thinking for decades now, but that still tops the list. 59% feel like that is one of the most in-demand skills. Project management at 47%, computer skills at 47%, and so on and so forth. So, and then the most in-demand soft skills, which I don't have necessarily listed in the slide, but I'll share with you anyways. The most in-demand soft skills are teamwork. 39% of the respondents felt teamwork was the biggest and most important soft skill for an individual to learn. Adaptability, or the ability to adapt to change, was number 2, and then leadership was number 3. Moving on to the next slide. So we asked them what college majors are the most in demand in your company, what college majors are most in demand, and computer information systems was by far the largest at 63%. And so overall, this kind of in-demand skills theme really did revolve quite a bit around technology. And so if you jump to the next slide, you'll see the key takeaways for this theme were really that educators need to think about a couple of things. One, how to integrate the skills of technology and digital fluency for all learners. And there's a lot of conversation right now around digital fluency. It's not just for technologists. It's not just for those in computer information science programs. Digital fluency is something that is relevant for really anyone that's going to be entering the workforce. We're headed to a time where it's estimated that 60% of the future jobs by 2030 are going to interact with some form of artificial intelligence or some sort of bot. And so that requires levels of digital fluency that haven't previously existed or been needed in the workforce. And so I think it's important for educators to think through in every program, in every focus area, how do we make digital fluency more impactful? And that doesn't just mean let's have an online course. Obviously, that's becoming more and more common. Many people offer online courses. That doesn't equate to digital fluency. Digital fluency is really how you use technology as it would relate to the skills that you're deploying in your work environment. And so I think it's important to think through that across all programs. And one of the things that at Learning House we've done is we have a coding minor program that we work with colleges and universities to implement, that really helps with, regardless of what degree program they're going after, they have the chance to learn some of these digital fluency skills around coding and software development. I think the other important thing is educators should consider technology-centric programs and courses as a primary opportunity. Obviously, anything related to STEM, it's only going to grow. Mathematics and science and data science and data visualization and a whole host of other things that kind of revolve around the impact of technology on the economy and the workforce. And so the more higher education institutions position themselves to be able to offer STEM related programs and STEM centric programs, I think the better off they will be. All right, so moving on to theme number 4. We spent a little bit of time, a couple questions, just digging into alternative pathways and other things that companies are looking at. And we explored a lot of things, everything from, are they making bets in artificial intelligence? Are they focusing on outsourcing and hiring untraditional candidates? What kind of credentials are they using to validate skills, hard skills learned, things to that nature. And so I'm going to share a little bit. You can get more of the details in our full report online. But moving on to the next slide, I wanted to share this one with you. We asked them, what credentials is your company most open to with validating hard skills? And the college degree was still up there. It was number 2 on the list. 77% said it's one that they look to for considering validating a hard skill, which is good. Certificates top the list, but below that, we had project portfolios, which is something that a lot of both companies and universities are starting to do more of. And I've seen several products out in the market now that help students, that colleges basically get these vendors that help students build project portfolios and help turn their classes and the skills that they're learning in their degree program, turning that into a project portfolio that speaks more directly to how employers would want to interpret what you gained out of your degree program. And so there's many organizations out there trying to help solve that problem, to kind of get the language of academics and the language of enterprise synced up so that it makes students ability to transfer those skills into the job market a little more seamless. They also look at different types of skills, boot camps, MOOC certificates, badging, and others. If you jump to the next slide, we asked them, what kind of learning mechanisms are you using to reskill or upskill your workforce? And, coaching, instructor-led training, books, manuals, peer mentoring, self-paced, self-directed classes, learning management system. It was interesting, university courses or certificates came in 7th place at 30% mark. And when you kind of juxtapose that to the previous slide, which was, certificates and college degrees are the most common way at which they use to validate hard skills. It's not the most common way. It's kind of the least common way in many ways that they use to upskill and reskill their workforce. And so, only 30% are actually utilizing university courses or certificates when it comes to upskilling or reskilling. I do think that potentially poses a great opportunity for forward-thinking universities and educators. So a couple key takeaways if you jump to the next slide for this theme around really kind of alternative, what we call the alternative pathway theme. Employers don't naturally think that degrees and universities can help solve their problems, but they do think educators can help them. Educators can help them solve their problems. And I guess the point being that if the way that we are thinking about solving this problem is only through the lens of a degree, that can be problematic. If we're thinking about it through the lens of it might look like something different, but as educators, whether we're at higher education institutions or something else, as educators, we certainly have ways to solve those problems. Employers, employers don't naturally think of us as helping, but they do think that as educators, we could help solve the problem if we would think about it differently. Also, repositioning program content and unbundling programs, could make it align better with skill needs, specific skill needs. This has been something that's been talked about for a long time, the unbundling of the degree. It's nothing new. It hasn't been widely deployed yet because it's not easy. And especially, when you're thinking about the economics of all of it, there's a lot of challenges that go into that. But I think it's important for educators if they want to help close the skills gap, especially as it relates to the millions of workers that are in jobs that need to upskill and reskill, that repositioning program and unbundling program content could be a potential solution. So don't give up on that thought. I know there's a lot of challenges involved in that, but I think there are people out there, there are organizations out there figuring this out. And I think the degree is still one of the most used indicators for skill validation by employers. So as much as people want to kind of hate on the devaluing of the degree, obviously price is going up and people having harder and harder time getting a job. There's no sign that the degree is going away. A few years ago, we'd see crazy titles and kind of hyper sensitive titles that would say things like the degree is dead. Well, it's not, and it's not going to be, at least from what we're hearing from HR leaders. It's still one of the top tools that they use to validate hard skills. It's one of the best tools that they have right now to really assess someone's capability. Now, all that to say, there are things happening in the marketplace that are trying to compete against that. So it's important as educators, we continue to be aware of those and we continue to provide better experience, better outcomes, better students who hopefully are more work ready. All right, so the last theme is really around the value of upskilling and reskilling. And when we talk about the value, it's really about the investment. It was really around the investment that they are willing to make. So if you jump to the next slide, so the survey found that 74% of companies are investing in upskilling, and about half are spending $500 or more per employee. 62% of them are investing in reskilling current employees, and 40% are investing $500 or more per employee. So, there's kind of a difference in how they're reskilling and upskilling, but in most cases, they're spending at least $500. Now, $500 is not, significant. This kind of figure really shocked me. Now, I did notice that when we drill down deeper, Fortune 500 companies are spending closer to $1,500 to $2,000 per employee on upskilling. And when we talk about this money is typically training money. It's money allocated for training and development. It's separate from tuition reimbursement. And so a lot of times when we work with companies, we're looking at, for Learning House Enterprise Solutions, we're looking at ways to combine both training budgets and the benefit that they offer outside of their training budget, which is the tuition reimbursement dollars. And that really allows forward-thinking companies to invest more money in more targeted reskilling and upskilling, and often get better outcomes. But overall, I was really disappointed to see that they're really spending less than $500. Half a company are spending less than $500 a year, especially in light of the fact that a third of employers really believe that this skills gap is making them less profitable. So I think the key takeaway here, if you move on to the next slide, is that companies still haven't fully shifted their investment efforts toward upskilling and reskilling. They're still, they're kind of at this, what seems to be this precipice of realizing this is a big issue, but they haven't shifted their money to say, yeah, we're gonna tackle this issue in a pretty radical way. I am seeing some companies take that challenge on, and you probably see them in the news here and there, where they're trying different things. They're working with, different. Walmart, for example, recently worked with a couple of universities to build out a specific degree program, a custom degree program that they're offering to their employees for essentially $1 a day, and Walmart's subsidizing the rest. And so, there are some companies out there, you will read and see those stories from time to time, that are being forward thinking and are trying to put more investment there for a variety of reasons. One, to attract better talent; two, to retain better talent; and three, to provide the skill sets that their organization needs to move ahead. And I think all those things are kind of coming to a culmination, where in the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see more and more organizations put much more than $500 against this, as a way to both attract and retain and get the skill sets that they need. So I think the other important part is figuring out how to both identify and articulate the ROI for the efforts around upskilling and reskilling. If educators want to be successful in this, it can't be, it's got to be data driven. It's got to have that ROI component, that makes it a lot easier, especially when they're investing $500. If you can get them to invest, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 and show that there is a clear ROI on it, many organizations are willing to do that. And that's what we've seen with the few forward-thinking organizations that have started kind of down this path. All right, so I want to give you kind of, as we wrap up here, some recommendations. So if we move on to this final slide here, a few just simple recommendations. One, if you're an educator on the call today, I'd really encourage you to work on opportunities to develop collaborative conversations with employers. And if you're an employer on the line today, I'll tell you, reach out to your local university and start having the discussions around, what you could do to start to fill some of the skills gap. I think it would be, I think everyone, that's probably an overstatement, but majority of people in academic space and on the employer side, they have a real interest in solving this problem. And I think we have solutions to talk through. I think secondly, if you are an educator on the line, you really ought to think about digital fluency and how to integrate it everywhere, in order to prepare students for the future workforce, because the need for digital fluency isn't decreasing, it's only increasing. So think about how you can, especially if you're on the academic side of institution, think about digital fluency and how to utilize that, integrate that to create the best experience and best outcomes for students. And then lastly, I think all of us, whether you're an employer or an educator, we really need to wrestle with reconfiguring the degree for greater adaptability and flexibility. There are those out there that are very creative in how they do this, everything from competency-based education to custom certificates, to a lot of different, there's just a lot of different ways, and I'm sure ways that we haven't even imagined yet. But I think it's important that we continue to wrestle with that to make sure that we're able to provide the right type of learning experiences that meet the needs of the modern workforce. And so I'd leave you with that, and I want to just kind of I guess take a couple minutes here to open it up for any questions that I could help respond to, and have a little bit of conversation if anyone has any questions.
So we do have a few questions already. So the first question is, do employers have a specific definition of work ready?
So do employers have a specific definition of work ready? The answer is yes, but it's very specific to each of them. When we tried to dig into that, it ranges from everything on how to, specifically around digital fluency. And when I say that as an example, you know, they don't know how, statements like they don't know how to use Salesforce. Well, that's something that, college generally is not going to teach you. Two, things like they, if they're getting into data fields or finance fields or things to that nature, they don't know how to use pivot tables or Excel. And those, so they didn't, I wouldn't say they had a very clear definition of what work ready is. They could point to specific examples of where they felt like students weren't work ready. And a lot of it did relate to digital fluency, but it also, a lot of it related to really the ability to critically think, to apply maybe certain principles that they should have learned in college to, modern day work scenarios. So it really was all over the board and very specific to each organization. It wasn't like, 40% of them had the same kind of work ready definition, which is part of the challenge that we're facing. So great question.
Okay, so the next question is a two-part question. When we refer to the skills gap, what exactly are we defining as a skill, and what do employers consider the definition of a skill?
So when we refer to the skills gap, I think that's why we did this study. We were trying to figure out what they are thinking about it, because we've had a lot of dialogue similar to what we had today. Um, and obviously we've been having this dialogue since, at least 2012. And it hasn't gotten better. And so I think that is part of the challenge, is syncing up. There's, again, a lot of different views around what employers are thinking. There's a lot of different views around what academics are thinking. Most of it, I think what I often think about is driving it back to kind of BLS data and looking at specific job openings and outcomes. So when you talk about a skill, in most cases, they are referencing specific hard skills that are being lacked. Things, everything from data science to engineering skill sets to new programming languages to even all the way back to soft skills. So I don't know if I'm answering the question real clearly, but again, it is a wide variety, and that's why there's not a one size fits all. And that's why much of this needs to happen through dialogue and working with a specific employer to better understand what skills they are defining as a skill. Is it a soft skill? Is it a hard skill? Is it a technical skill? And how we could start to integrate some of that into, specific outcomes. And, schools that are, or universities that are doing a good job of this will have advisory boards of employers that kind of come up with and invest in what the program needs to look like, and get some of this data out of that.
Okay, so the next question is, as institutions, we can only teach so much. What other resources might we consider to get students work ready?
Well, there's a lot there. I think exposure, there's a couple things. One, exposure to internships, exposure to large employers in your area, for them to come in and share what work ready means. Um, and even doing digital tours of the facility to kind of learn about different jobs. And then I think access, there's, it's not an issue of availability of resources. I mean, you can learn just about anything on your own these days that you would want. Now, some of it requires a lot more, but and requires a lot of discipline, but there's access to the content that you would need to learn. There's plenty of that. I think it's really about directionally what they need to learn, and that's where we can help them most. Um, with kind of search engine and encyclopedia is no longer being needed, because everything's at our fingertips. The challenge is not can we get the information we need. It's really what's the right question to ask. It's what's the right skill, that I need to learn. And so I think that's where, as educators, yeah, we should be teaching them, uh, you know, as much as we need and what's right. But there's always going to be more skills in what we can teach. And so I think it's helping students become aware of the resources around them, be aware of what skill sets are needed and required in the marketplace, specifically in the sector that they're going to go into, whether it's healthcare or business or whatever, accounting, helping them understand, all the things that go into that. And that doesn't happen without close ties or linking arms with employers in your area.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeremy. Those are the questions that we have for today. And I want to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. We hope you found the information that we shared valuable. And let us know what you thought about today's webinar. You can do so by taking our survey. The link was just posted in the chat pane, so go ahead and do that. And if you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at webinars@learninghouse.com. You can also download a copy of the Closing the Skills Gap digital report at this link right here. And yeah, thanks for joining us today. This webinar was presented by the Learning House, and learn more about Learning House at learninghouse.com. Have a good day. Bye.